So let me start with question, especially Ritu, I'm going to start with you. Share one of your best AI project which went into production, and what was it and what impact did it make?
So I'm actually very excited to share this. It's a tool called AI. It's a small company out of India. And the way I like to describe this, it's like Clary for late stage pipeline. This is for early stage pipeline. And marketing is always in that zone where we're constantly reporting on what happened last quarter. MQLs, SQLs, conversion rates, S2 pipeline. This helps us predict. It helps us look at historical data and the new information that we have and helps us predict what's going to happen, or at least within a reasonable margin. What's going to happen if we launch this campaign with this kind of content to this audience. So for me, that's really changed us from thinking about hindsight to thinking about what's going to happen, be predictive, change the conversation with CFOs, change the conversation with my CRO counterparts. So for us, that was a big win.
Fantastic. Greg?
So I'm going to go backwards in time and talk a little bit about predictive AI versus generative. 10 years ago, when I was running design at GE, we built a product called Predictive. And the basic concept behind it was that a field service person didn't have to look for anything. It knew where you were. It knew what parts were in your truck. It knew what thing you were working on. It knew the data of the thing. And it predicted what the most important next step might be for you, and it organized it for you in a very contextual experience. And I look back at that experience. We put it out into the field, and it allowed, sort of L1 field techs to operate like an L3, like someone with way more experience in the field. And the experience that we created was a kind of a precursor to the sort of agentic conversational interfaces that we see today. And so it still holds up, and I was really excited to see that it's still around as well.
Cool. Satish?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll sort of piggyback off of something Greg was sharing, right? So we have spent some time at Caterpillar. One of my favorite use cases was a connected machine-based lead gen that then went through a whole curation process with automation, and then fed into the supply chain based on prognostics of where the parts were necessary to be made available in the world, right? So you had the full cycle of everything from, products out in the field all the way back to supply chain that was, it's a B2B business, so, the dealers getting inventory demand signals from, connected assets out in the field, right? So being able to do that in a pretty closed loop, holistic way, right, was something. The proof point of that for me was I deployed this with what was supposed to be a prototype or a pilot in the real world. And I started getting calls at 3 a.m. from dealer principals, think of them as CEOs of billion-dollar companies in Eastern Australia, right, many time zones away, saying, hey, your solution went down, and, I needed to predict my overnight order for inventory, right? So,
Oh, cool. All are great examples and great products. Let me ask a question to Greg. Greg, you designed so many projects, AI products in both Cisco, GE, ServiceNow, and other places, and ton of startups, right? Generally, what are the biggest design mistakes people do? It kills the AI production.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, on the product side, there are a lot of questions that you can try to, you get caught up in stakeholders asking for certain things versus actually understanding the culture of the organization that you're building a product, or the archetypes that you're building a product for. I think inside of organizations, in my recent work in consulting, the biggest issue is that people focus on the technology, not on outcomes. And if they focused on how their business works, and then looked at the most important things to their business and then worked backwards from that, they would be much more successful. But my experience so far is that most folks who are looking at AI are implementing it without actually understanding what problems they're trying to solve. And therefore they run into outcomes that don't actually add value to the organization. So I guess my advice would be work backwards.
Okay. All right. Satish, a question to you, especially. You build so many tools and so many big projects, AI projects and thing. Generally in production, what fail apart?
Yeah, so I think the path to failure in the transition from a proof of concept to value at scale ends up being not focusing on the things that really matter, right? It's the business outcome, it's the business insight, right? So sort of very similar to Greg's comments, right? It's I think too often, the ideal world of a proof of concept in a sandbox or lab environment gets treated as a proxy. Everyone gets excited, and then say, quick, let's flip the switch and put it into production. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, right? What about all these other things, right? Operational scaling. Did we decide on how to make things reliable, robust, right? Not just the happy path, right? Those kinds of things get cast to the side, and
You think they're missed out or in the planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you do a POC, by definition, most times, especially if it's in the hands of the functional SMEs, right? If it's tech or data or AI, right? Those people are focused on their area of expertise. So not having someone come in and shape it. So if you begin with the end in mind and say, what are we trying to influence, work backwards, and then figure out what capabilities, enablers you need, then that changes the game, right? So it's very much the same thing. And, I'll put a plug in, right? I've become more and more, as time has passed, I've become a fan of something that's now branded as decision intelligence. It's very similar to, I think, what you were saying about looking at the outcomes first. If you begin with the outcome, the end in mind, most times any of these things we're talking about that we get excited about as, functional SMEs of some kind, focus on being an enabler, right? But if you begin and say all of these things are enabling either an insight that drives a decision or driving an action. And if you begin with that and say what insight or decision are we trying to drive, what action are we trying to drive, and work backwards and say what's necessary to do that at scale in a reliable and robust way in the real world, then the answers become more self-evident.
Okay, cool. Hey, Ritu, marketing is one of the first to generally consume AI, right? And especially you are so much skilled in scaling AI. What it actually takes, what actually fails to scaling, especially, right? Hundreds to millions of users.
So, I mean, Greg's the expert in system design, so it's probably a question for him, but you have to design the system. And that's the AI is a system that needs to work in the real world. So if you take AI, put it in a nice controlled environment, it has all the context it needs. Access to Salesforce, complete information. It's responding to a very controlled environment. And the minute you put it in front of a customer, the thing fails because it's dealing with emotion, it's dealing with ambiguity, it's dealing with incomplete information. So the first thing that fails is context. It just doesn't have the context in the real world. Second piece is governance. A lot of people design governance after the fact. Something happens and then I'm going to figure out my escalation path. I'm going to figure out ownership. I'm going to figure out what happens, human in the loop. So the system isn't designed for human in the loop, and the system isn't designed to because it's going to fail, trust me. And if it isn't designed for that, you're going to call it a failure and then move on to the next thing. So between context and governance, those are the two things that fail first. The other things are much smaller. You have to have outcomes. There has to be more reliability. But if you're able to solve those two things, you'll see a lot more success.
Great. See, failures are everywhere, right? Especially design issues, reliability issues, technology issues, code issues, so many things around. Let's flip the coin and look at exactly what works, especially. And let me ask a question to Satish. Satish, you did so many projects in Blue Cross and also Caterpillar and other places, especially, right? Especially, what are the non-negotiable things in AI when it comes to, because governance is such a key thing, right? So how do you look at it?
So I'd say, you heard me talk about alignment with the outcome first, right? So strategic alignment and viewing all of these things as enablers, right? I mean, I love to geek out with the best of them, but that's a hobby, right? We don't get paid for that in the real world, right? So being able to do that is important. I think strategic alignment, Ritu talked about governance, and I'd say not just governance in the tech, data, AI sense, but more broadly, I think, right? Some of the best successes I've had have come from partnering with functions that you wouldn't normally think of when you're doing this stuff, right? I mean, often it gets viewed as a roadblock, so privacy, right? I mean, I've been in a lot of highly regulated industries, so privacy, infosec, compliance, risk, right? If these things get included at the beginning, then those perceived sudden roadblocks that come as at the end as you try to make things wildly successful, right, start to go away because you're essentially getting ahead of the curve.
Do you use any specific framework or checklists?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big ones are, right, the alignment, the governance, more broad-based enterprise-wide governance, and then looking at risk, right? So you sort of look at it and say, those are the three things I always look for. And again, it's holistic. It's not intended. You try to bring in all the functions up front, not so much to get in the way, but to really make sure that the gotchas are identified up front, right? So you're thinking about them.
So question to Greg. So Greg, you design so many systems. I know trust is a bigger factor when it comes to design, right? How do you design for trust and making sure that, the trust builds into the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it depends on what kind of outcomes the AI is generating, right? So if it's qualitative conversation, then discernment is pretty straightforward. People don't have the expectation that it has to be perfect. And so they can take it, sort of learn and use it. But I'll give you an example. We were building a product at Cisco for security operations centers called XDR. And we added AI to it, but the SOC operators wouldn't use it. They didn't trust it. And we had to do some research to understand that what they really needed was attribution. And so I think in specific places where, you don't want to turn the CEO's laptop off or do something into your network without absolute confidence, and you have an AI system making a suggestion that there's a security threat that you need to take action on, the AI needs to say how it figured that out so that you can have confidence that you're making the right decision. And so I think that's part of it, is that we need, it depends on the importance of the decision that the human needs to make. And then depending on how that importance figures out, you have to find ways to communicate the efficacy of the suggestion or the action that the agent might take on your behalf. And then the last part is, my perspective is that when you have high risk decisions, then the human always has to be in the loop. And you don't automate that away. You make that a decision that a person is accountable and responsible for. So it sort of depends. If it's a creative exercise where you're generating lots of ideas, then, you can be a little bit more loose with the way that it operates. So there's not like one size fits all.
So end of the day, everything needs to be designed. This will be thoughtful decisions in terms of how do we design.
Yeah, you need to understand the context of who's using it, what are they trying to accomplish, what's meaningful for them, and what degree of anxiety or trust issues they have. And then you create a set of experiences, hopefully validated with that user base around what might make sense for them.
All right. So Ritu, you also sell a lot of these AI systems, correct? So how do you prove ROI of the system, how this agent's going to generate? And second thing is, especially, there is also a lot of hype cycle in AI. How do you manage that?
Let me answer the hype cycle first. Customers at this point are coming to us completely, calling out our bullshit. Let's put it that way. Nobody's believing the 2 weeks to production anymore. No one asks us the questions they used to, or what's going to happen if this thing doesn't know the answer. None of that. People are coming in asking very informed questions about latency, about edge cases, and we are having top level. We're having to put engineers instead of solution architects. Solution engineers. We're having to up level to answer the questions they're asking. They're very well educated now. So while there still is, the rhetoric, you'll still see LinkedIn, the 2 weeks to production. People are aware that they need to go to a POC before they buy anything. So that just means for the CFOs in the room, it's a very expensive sale. You're constantly in POC cycles, proving that this works, not just to the happy path, but edge cases. So hype cycle, I mean, we're having to conform to what the customer wants, which is pure honesty at this point.
All right. So, Satish, let's actually, this actually tells us that, how important all this decision making as a CXOs and leadership, we need to make a lot of decisions, especially whether it's design, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's users, whether these things, right? So, question to Satish is especially if you're looking at AI experiments across enterprises, how do you decide which should have proper investment to get into production? And then, do you use any framework to look at?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, that's super important, right? I mean, governance we've talked about in the context of what happens as you go through a process, but there's also, an investment governance process, if you will, right? Has different names.
Government process.
An investment process. I mean, it doesn't have to be heavyweight, but a process to actually do that. So I look at value, right? In the end, you begin with that in mind, business outcomes, business value, what's it going to do? Then I look at viability, right? So that's the traditional consulting 2x2, right? So you look at cost or, what it's going to take to actually implement. And then the third is kind of the third dimension out of the page, if you will, and that's velocity. How fast can you do it? Because very often the more traditional models have ignored that. And I think that's an important thing, right? Time to value becomes something that often gets ignored. So, being able to incorporate that in. So the 3 V's is what I typically use.
All right. That's a great framework, especially. Like, did you guys build it internally or typical framework which is available?
No, I mean, I think there's, any number of them out there, right? This is something that I've internalized over a period of time. So it's, it may be out there branded that way, but I can't attribute it to anyone in particular. I'm always happy to steal with pride and provide attribution as appropriate. So if I've misappropriated without it's unintentional, and I'll definitely look it up. That's a good question, right? I'll have to look it up and see if I misremembered where it came from. So
yeah. Ritu, Observe.ai actually created all these AI agents which just don't do conversations but also do a lot of these customer workflows and at scale. Companies like DoorDash does thousands and millions of conversations thing, right? What really happens, especially, right, generally we all know that, right? When you put together a PowerPoint presentation, we'll say that, hey, this is great and all of the things, but really come into the real production, right? It may not be that real. How do you manage that? How do you actually make sure people trust? And especially, how do you think about conveying the ROI of the investment?
So you have to agree with the customer first. And you have to sort of, while you plan for, the bigger transformation, you start small and you basically say, here are the 5 pieces we need to do to achieve X. And then try and figure out, make sure that the ROI that they're looking for is well informed, both to you and to the and for the customer. And there's somebody that owns the outcome within the customer location. Now, this is the most important part with AI, where the model cannot own the outcome, right? So you have to have a real person that owns the outcome and that's able to help push this. And then between the vendor and the customer, you're jointly responsible for that ROI that you deliver. It is a slow process, and anybody that tells you you're going to get your ROI within the first year is probably pushing the truth a little bit. It's going to take more than a year. It is, because the amount of investment that you need, human investment from both the customer side and the vendor side, you're throwing in FTEs, you're throwing in PS, you're trying to get all of this integrated into the systems. It's very large. So you are going to go through a year where you're going to have to commit to both people and resource investment. And then you look at ROI actually in year 2. So having that conversation up front for anybody that's selling AI is super important, because it's not going to show you immediate ROI. It just isn't.
Yeah, that's true. And let me ask all the panelists a question. Let me start with Greg. Greg, when it comes to timelines, everyone is interested in timelines, right? When it comes to real projects, when we have a successful pilot, okay, now we want to move into production. So what actually, how do you plan your timeline? It's not that something you showcase in the deck, but, in reality, what happens?
Well, I think there was the way we used to do it, and I think there's the way I think that makes sense to me now. We just did a project with an architectural practice in San Francisco, and we spent a lot of time trying to understand their business and the outcomes that mattered, and we looked at the data that we had access to, and we figured out a set of things that we could do with them. And then we found the smallest thing we could do, and then we did it. And we built a really simple agent that saved 15 minutes of time on a 2-hour task.
That's a good metric.
It was a great metric for them, and it's a task that they do a lot of in the organization. And so the ROI was actually quite good. And it was a really simple UI. It was literally, drag something out of your email into this agent, and it gave you a briefing on how to answer a problem. A very, very simple thing. And there are two things that happened with that. One, it was super easy to deploy. Like, we just gave it to people and they just started using it, and they're like, wow, this is great. It didn't require an enormous amount of energy to support. And it allowed the culture of the organization to start feeling comfortable with using AI-based tools. And so I guess the thing I would say is, start really small and find the highest value, simplest thing that you can do. And we kind of call it like, no one likes to do the dishes or no one likes to do the laundry. So look for the laundry or the dishes and find one thing that allows people to retain and have more time to do the things they want to do, and then move on to the next one. And so that would be my advice.
Ritu, your take?
You can actually get it done in a week if it talks to nothing.
Wow,
especially
in a week.
Oh yeah, if it's completely in a silo, there's not connected to anything, maybe just one system, you can actually get these things in production in a week. Now, if you want to do it right, and you're actually building a cross-functional workflow, it takes anywhere from 3 months to whenever, because you're dealing with change management, you're dealing with training your people, you're dealing with building whatever needs to be built around it so that it connects into the system. So it is a digital transformation project. Yeah. So remember the RPA days, remember, that's what it is. These things, people started building this 2 years ago. These systems are not perfect. It's going to take time. But yes, if you're very small, siloed workflow that doesn't connect to too many things, for a few people, you can get it done.
That's interesting. Especially that's a good CMO take, marketing take. Let's ask real engineering same question. Satish.
Well, I think, I agree with Ritu on the, in a vacuum. I think she said it somewhat tongue in cheek about 1 week. I was going to say, because she was making the joke earlier about the 2-week deployment, I was going to say 15 days, right? 1 day beyond the full team. But realistically, a lot of my career has been in large, complex enterprises, or extended ecosystems that include, multi-enterprise type such setups. And there, obviously, all of the aspects that, you heard the other speakers talk about are amplified multiple fold. So, on the deck, when you pitch it, right, you get the more optimistic folks that have been in my team that say, oh, no, 3 months, right? We'll get it done in 3 months. And the reality is 3 months is when you actually begin to deploy, right? So realistically, in a large enterprise setting, I actually agree with your 1 year timeline. I almost never promise for a class of use cases that are large and complex. I never promise any return in the first year because it takes you that long to deploy with quality at scale. So the realistic timelines are 9 to 12 months to get it out the door and, working the way you want, non-happy path where you don't have the whoops, we just discriminated against somebody, we auto-denied a claim, we, unintentionally didn't give someone a mortgage and it correlates heavily to some bias that we didn't even know about, right? So things like that. And then, I'd say a more pragmatic, like when you can actually start counting on business value, right? The return starting to accrue. And I always hammer that home. Every team I've had the privilege of leading, right? They kind of get sick of me saying that because I say that every staff meeting. It's like, look, guys and gals, right? Business value starts from the day you deploy to production. Until then, it's just a hobby. We're getting paid to do really cool stuff as a hobby, right? So that's 12 to 15 months, easy, right?
All right, amazing. I think, I would also like to have some time for the room to have some questions. Before that, what is one thing? We have a fantastic audience here, all these expos of people going to make a lot of impact to the economy, impact to the society, impact to the businesses, all of them here. What is one thing you want to share from your experience? It could be a mistake, or it could be the patterns which you are seeing, like, going wrong in the production, or something you want to suggest them. Satish.
Sure. I'll keep it short because I sort of got passionate about some things in this conversation, right? So I'll say, fall out of love with your favorite hammer, widget, whatever you like, and fall in love with the business outcome and the value you're delivering.
Awesome. Ritu?
I think the one thing I see is you have CXOs come in and they want AI for digital transformation. They want to change the world. And then they deploy it in the smallest silo, in the most useless project, in the broken systems, and then they expect that it's going to work. So you can't do that. You have to give it a real job. You have to give it a cross-functional job. You have to allow it to prove itself. You can't deploy it in the least, useful way possible and expect miracles.
Greg?
I would say just be really good at mapping how work gets done in your organization. Because I think the opportunity, most enterprises have kind of a Rube Goldberg machine of technology set up to deliver the outcomes that they are interested in running their business with. And part of that's because of the legacy of technology choices that they've made and the capabilities of those choices to execute on those outcomes. And, generative allows lots of opportunities to disrupt those at certain points, but you don't know where to insert it unless you map the path to the outcome. And you can either start from the beginning or work backwards, but either way, discern how people and technology work together to deliver a business outcome, and then inspect very carefully for the opportunities to add an agent or a capability with these technologies to move faster. And I don't look at anything unless I see maps anymore. It's really important for me to see a map of how do you get from here to there, because it gives you an anchor point to have the discussion about culture, around how people operate, and what tools they use, how frequently it gets done, how important it is to the business, et cetera. And then you can have real conversations about where to implement this really exciting set of new technologies.
All right. So this is fantastic. See, there are multiple things which we discussed about, a lot of amazing insight from all these panelists, especially we spoke about. The key ones are especially designing trust is very much important, understanding the customer, which Greg was talking about. And then when Ritu was actually making a very, very strong point on the ROI factor, right? Which is ROI in terms of, how this is going to work, how you're going to add value to the customer, not just basically selling something. And Satish shared a lot of stuff in terms of the frameworks he's thinking about, what exactly the investment needs to be put together so that investment can be justified. The frameworks which they have worked on, pretty interesting. And hopefully, I think, this will be helpful for you.